Welcome, everyone. We're so thrilled you're here with us tonight for a special conversation with Eric K. Ward of the Western State Center. I'm Marcia Bloomberg, and as it happens, I'm a volunteer member of all three of the organizations sponsoring our program tonight. I'm Soma Action's Religious Justice Co-Chair, a member of the Summit Interfaith Council's Anti-Racism Committee, and part of Congregation Beth Hatikva's Anti-Racism Project, as well as a member of the Western State Center's Anti-Hate Network. And I'll be co-moderating the program tonight with Reverend Vernon Williams. We plan to be posing some questions for Eric tonight related to the title of our program, and we'll leave some time toward the end for the audience to pose their own Q&A questions and answers, or I suppose answers. I mean questions. Eric hopefully will answer. A few words on Zoom etiquette. Most of you, I'm sure, are more than familiar with Zoom by this time, but just in case, the best way to watch the webinar is on speaker view. So only those with a speaking part can be seen. All participants will be muted throughout the program, but again, there's a chat function and you can pose your questions in that chat. We wanted to thank our wonderful tech volunteers, Josh Silberman and Aretha Johnson, who are here today. And if you have any technical difficulties, I can't promise that they'll be able to fix them, but they will certainly try. So if you're having any technical issues and you're already in the program with us, you can put your issue into the chat and they should see it. At this point, I would like to ask Rabbi Hannah Orden to bring greetings from Congregation Beth Hatikva, one of our sponsors.
Thank you, Marcia. Hadn't really thought about the fact that you were on all three sponsoring organizations. And want to welcome everybody. Congregation Beth Hatikva is proud to be one of the sponsors of this program. I first heard Eric Ward speak at the Summit Holocaust Remembrance Service in 2019. And I was incredibly impressed with his brilliant understanding of the intersection of racism, anti-Semitism, and white nationalism. And I remember at the time, I wished that more people in our community could have heard him. And I have been scheming and hoping ever since to bring him back to Summit. And now, thanks to the wonders of modern technology, Eric can join us without leaving the West Coast. We need his voice more than ever, and I am grateful that so many people can hear Eric's perspective on the ongoing demonstrations for racial justice, as well as the upcoming elections. Eric, thank you so much for sharing your time with us and helping us prepare for the challenges ahead.
Thank you so much. It's such a pleasure to be here tonight.
And now that Reverend Vernon Williams is here, thank goodness, we're happy to see him. Would you like to introduce yourself a bit and then ask Pastor Moore to bring greetings?
Sure. Good evening to everyone, and greetings to Eric Ward. Thank you for joining us on tonight. We want to welcome everyone on tonight for this conversation and discussion on Portland policing and white supremacy. What can we do? I will be co-moderating tonight's event with Marcia Bloomberg. I am the Reverend Vernon Williams. I am Associate Minister at the Fountain Baptist Church in Summit, New Jersey. I'm also the Vice President of the Summit Interfaith Council and a member of our Anti-Racism Committee in Summit. We are very much engaged in this area of social justice, and so it's very important to us to have this conversation and to talk about what we can do and discover solutions and answers that we can work on going forward. With that being said, I am going to ask the Reverend Gladys Moore if she would come and bring greetings on behalf of the Summit Interfaith Council. Unmute first, Gladys. Unmute, Gladys.
Let's unmute Gladys. Good evening, everybody. I am the senior of the two pastors at St. John's Lutheran Church here in Summit. And on behalf of the Summit Interfaith Council Anti-Racism Committee, it is my pleasure to welcome all of you to this important event. And thank you so much, Eric, for joining us. As evidenced by last evening's fatal shooting of Walter Wallace in Philadelphia, it is increasingly important for us to know about how we can respond to the continued killing of Black and brown men and women by police in our country. And it's especially urgent as we continue to hear threats from the White House about the potential deployment of federal resources in response to the unrest in Philadelphia. This sounds like Portland to me. We in the Summit Interfaith Council Anti-Racism Committee are especially gratified that we're co-sponsoring this event with the Summit Foundation, Congregation Beth Hatikva, and Soma Action. I think the more we do together, the stronger we become. So thank you all for being with us tonight.
Thank you. And I'd like to introduce Ritu Pancholi from Soma Action to bring greetings from that organization.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ritu Pancholi. Thank you, Marcia, for having me and everyone else. I'm the president of Soma Action. For those of you who might not know, Soma Action is a 501c4 organization that started post-Trump in order to mobilize citizens at a grassroots level to protect people's rights, to fight against white supremacy, and to bring out the vote. Our members are heavily invested right now in GOTV and making sure people's votes are counted, and that people are, really monitoring the election process. That said, Eric, I can't wait to hear you talk, because we know that our work does not stop on Election Day. And I am committed as the president of Soma Action. I know Marcia has been leading us so well with the Religious Justice Committee, but we know that white supremacist groups will not stop post-election. We know that our intersectional focus must continue. And I, personally want to know, what can I do as an individual and what can I do as a leader in my community to ensure that I continue to stick up whenever I see hate. So thank you.
Thank you, Ritu.
Thank you.
I now have the pleasure of introducing Eric Ward to everyone who's on our webinar tonight. And he has a long and distinguished career and has won many awards. And so I actually have to read the introduction. It's just too much for me to remember. So Eric has, as I said, a long and distinguished career as a social justice advocate, working over the past 30 years with local, state, and national organizations to implement strategies for change around racial justice, immigrant rights, and combating anti-Semitism. He is the Western State Center's executive director and one of the most inspiring leaders in the fight against white nationalism. Based in the Pacific Northwest and Mountain States, Western State Center works nationwide to strengthen inclusive democracy. The center works with movements, organizations, and leaders to harness regional advocacy to advance racial, gender, and economic opportunity and justice in the West. But Eric has not worked just in the Northwest. He's worked around the country and the world. From 2003 until 2011, he served as the national field director for the Center for New Community, assisting immigrant rights organizations in addressing the growing xenophobic influence on public policy. He's also worked as a Ford Foundation program officer, where grant making supported efforts to combat inequality and inequity around the world. He's also the author of the 2017 essay, Skin in the Game, How Anti-Semitism Animates White Nationalism. And I first met Eric exactly 2 years ago, I think, here in South Orange, New Jersey, when you spoke at Congregation Oheb Shalom about the article that you had written about racism, anti-Semitism, and white nationalism. So we're thrilled and honored to have you here today. And I have to say, since meeting you 2 years ago, I don't have many heroes, but you're one of them.
Thank you, Marcia. It's such a pleasure to be here. I wish I was with you all in person. I miss you all. I have fond memories of being with you all breaking bread with you and coming together in community. And you know, Soma Action has done incredible work. We're proud to partner with Soma Action here at Western State Center as part of our growing national anti-hate network of experts and leaders. And we know Soma Action and those who support it make the community a stronger, more vibrant place. And it's just a pleasure to be with you today. It's wonderful because I know we're going to be doing questions and answers. So that's great, because then I don't have a prepared speech. And when I don't, you know, my staff gets nervous because they know I have lots of passions, and but they're not that nervous. And I just want to really, before we even start, you know, just acknowledge everyone on the call, whether you're in New Jersey, whether you're Summit area, whether you're other parts of the United States. I just have to tell you this right off the start before we inevitably run out of time. And I am just deeply appreciative of what every person on this call has accomplished over the last 4 years. It has been a hard time. And despite that, each of you has found that one thing, whether it was caring and standing for a neighbor, whether it was engaging in the political process, whether it was dropping off food, right? Just caring for one another and building that intimacy that is so critically important for community. And I don't think it gets said enough just how grateful I am, and so many are in this country. We've come a long way. We've done it despite the burdens of a global pandemic, record unemployment, right? Political violence across America. You all have carried so much on your backs, and I know we have a little bit to go. I know that things look swirling in their chaos, but I want to let you know that each of you has brought your game into this moment. You have brought the highest aspirations of America into this moment, and you've brought your hearts into this moment. And I just want to let you know that I see that. I honor it, and I'm deeply moved and appreciative of it.
Thank you, Eric. So are you ready for our first question?
I am ready. I am so ready.
Okay. The Western State Center is in Portland, and Portland was the center of action during the recent racial justice protests. It's also an area where extremism seems to be more overt and rampant than here in New Jersey. What's your take on what's been happening in Portland related to the protests and to the presence of white supremacists and extremists in the Northwest, and why Portland in particular?
Yes, so for well over 200 days, there have been nearly every night in Portland, Oregon, demonstrations against police brutality and in support of Black Lives Matter. Despite what most folks have seen on television, which I'll get to in a second, most of that has been largely non-violent in terms of Black Lives Matter protesters and others. There have been some incidences of vandalism and property damage, and I'm not here to defend that tonight. But I am here to say, as someone who lives in Portland, Oregon, and who has spent a lot of time in Portland, Oregon, that it actually has been very, very limited in terms of the sheer number of people who are mobilized on the streets each and every night. These demonstrators have faced draconian policing, police brutality that even Physicians for Human Rights and other national organizations such as the American Civil Liberties Union and others have brought attention to. These nonviolent protesters have also faced harassment and intimidation and violence from armed paramilitary organizations associated with white nationalists and the far right in this country. Despite that, These protests and demonstrations take place each and every night. I want to place this in a context, though. These protests and the anger didn't start with the killing of George Floyd. As you remember, George Floyd is an African-American man who was killed by law enforcement in Minneapolis. You will not hear me use the word murdered, and I choose not to use the word murdered because these are sanctioned killings, right? These are killings that are protected by policing laws in this country, by policies that allow law enforcement to disproportionately target African-American men and kill them and not be held accountable in any ways. These are not killings that largely break the law. There is something immoral about our laws that allow the disproportionate killing of unarmed Black men and other African Americans in our country. That has occurred here in Portland, Oregon as well for decades. And for decades, African American leaders have worked endlessly to change policy and to raise these issues. I think, like most of the country, the murder of George Floyd was hard to take. And you saw the anger in the streets of Portland. Not only the anger over police killings, but the anger over the bias in policing of nonviolent demonstrations here. So that's what we're seeing in Portland, Oregon. And I just want to add a couple of other pieces of context to this that I think are important. We have to note that I live in a region of the country, the Pacific Northwest and the Mountain States region, that has long been a target of white nationalists and other hate organizing. It is long-standing. It started in terms of in the public eye with the arrival of Richard Butler, who is a pastor at the time who moved his church from Orange County up here to the Pacific Northwest to Hayden Lake and launched the Aryan Nations. And the Aryan Nations was a church that taught three things. The first was that Jews were the literal children of Satan. The second was that people of color were subhuman, meaning chattel without souls. And the third was that white Northern Europeans were the true lost tribes of Israel, and that the United States was the homeland, was the promised land for the white race. The Aryan Nations eventually launched what was known as the Northwest Imperative in an attempt in the 80s and 90s to take over the Pacific Northwest and Mountain States through organizing, through violence, through propaganda. Now, it was never going to happen in that period for a number of reasons, but it did set a narrative and tone. The movement was able to take advantage of local culture, the live and let live, and libertarian values of our region. They were able to seed their narrative in significant ways. And we here in the Pacific Northwest continue to struggle. We often referred to that as the invisible war until 4 years ago, where the rest of America was exposed to what has been happening here in the Pacific Northwest for nearly 3 decades. Despite the ideas of Portlandia, a very popular comedy show, the Pacific Northwest could rightfully be thought of as the Northern South. In fact, here in Portland, it has been referred to as Upper Mississippi or Northern Mississippi in terms of attitudes around race and gender. We have a long way to go, but it is those historical foundations that laid out the current conditions that we are dealing with here in Portland, Oregon. Whether it is the brutality of a rogue police unit and law enforcement that is unanswerable or seems unwilling to answer to civilian leadership, whether it is federal incursions into the streets of Portland with quasi-paramilitary forces that increase the violence, or 3, whether it is dealing with paramilitary alt-right groups and vigilantes who have created a cycle of violence. What we know is that here in the Pacific Northwest, democracy is under siege. We have been hard at work building tools to respond to this, and tools that we are sharing across the country, lessons we are sharing. But we should be clear, we have a long way to go in uprooting this narrative of exclusion that seeks to divert the United States of America from living up to its highest aspirations, and instead seeks to drown us in fear, in cynicism, and the idea that we aren't neighbors, which of course we are.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric. The next question is, in your exposition of 21 things those committed to inclusive democracy can do right now, you state in your point number 1, recognize the precarious moment that American democracy finds itself in right now. What do you see as this precarious moment, and why is it so urgent?
This is a good question about what moment are we in, and thank you for asking that question. I did write in 21 things that we have to understand that democracy is not a given. It is, and that despite the idea of American exceptionalism, our democracy is at risk, just like every other democracy in the world. Whether we are looking at Hungary, whether we are looking at Poland, whether we are looking at events in Russia, China, right, or any other places in the country, in the world, Brazil comes to mind right now. We need to understand that democracy is under siege. The idea of democracy, people-centered, transparent, accountable government is not that new to the world. Right? It has only been with us for about 200 years. And for that 200 years, it has been contested primarily by authoritarian leaning moments in societies. And we face one of those authoritarian leaning moments. We face it for 3 reasons. The first has to do with demographic change, right? Which is quite natural. And so is the demographic anxiety, right? The fear of change, the fear of being in new environments. Those are natural things. But white nationalists have figured out how to tap into that demographic anxiety and recast it as an existential threat, rather than something we become accustomed to and we adapt to and actually brings riches of diversity and abundance to our lives. They frame it as a race war, as a civil war, something to enter with a mindset of scarcity. But the other, besides demographic anxiety, is the huge expanse and economic inequality that has happened in our society over the last 20 years. And it has been significant. Now, I want to be clear, for particularly African Americans and Latinos and Native Americans, that economic inequality isn't new. If you ask Americans, there was a poll that was done that was quite interesting. If you ask Americans, what percentage of Blacks do they believe were wealthy previous to 1965, right? The answer is that somewhere between 40 and 50% of Americans believe that 40% to 50% of Black people in pre-civil rights America were wealthy. Now, the answer actually is 5%, right? 5% of Black people pre-civil rights could be called wealthy. Now, you ask folks, what is that today, right? What percentage is that today? You ask the same grouping, and folks will say about 80% of Black America has wealth. The truth is that 75 years after the civil rights movement, it's still 5%, right? So economic inequality hasn't shifted significantly for people of color. We still suffer as we have suffered. Mm-hmm. But where it has shifted is with the white middle and white working class. Their wealth is now starting to move into the hands, right, of large corporations, who don't give back into communities, who don't reinvest. So the inequality of wealth right now in America is significant. And while that wealth is not the cause of bigotry, it does provide an opening for bigotry, because we in America are much more tolerant of people's mistakes when we feel that it is driven by economic pressure. And so what has happened in this country is, between demographic anxiety, between economic, right, inequality, it has provided ripe soil for this white nationalist movement in America. And there's a third piece that I want to address really quickly, which is the inability of left and liberal spaces to align in a way that allows it to both engage conservatives, right, and negotiate with conservatives. I'm not talking about white nationalists. I'm not talking about the far right. In order to build an alternative vision of an America that meets the needs of communities around the United States. So absent of that silo, adding the economic inequality, adding the demographic anxiety, it allowed the white nationalist movement over time to move from the margins to the mainstream. It had a plan about what America should look like. It had an opinion on who was an American. And that allowed it to be the only viable alternative to the status quo that an increasing number of Americans say does not work for them, right? And those of us in our bubbles were late to the game in acknowledging that that America did not work for most Americans. And so slowly that white nationalist coalition built through trial and error. And eventually it built enough power to engage in a coalition with the Trump campaign. And that campaign was ultimately able to gain power here in the United States. That provided further credibility and voice to this white nationalist movement. It allowed it to build a larger coalition, which is known as the alt-right, right? The alt-right isn't made up of all white nationalists. It's a coalition of right-wing forces. So at the end of the day, what I speak to is acknowledging the moment that we are in. Not all social movements are grounded in inclusion. We are facing a social movement, in fact, that is grounded in exclusion. And just like our social movements, thinking of the civil rights movement, right? Thinking of Occupy Wall Street, thinking of the anti-apartheid movement, of the Equal Rights Amendment, of the LGBTQ rights community, it too has built power to shape policy and to shape narrative and reality in our society. When I speak of the anger, what I'm saying in short is this, that we have to recognize that there is deep anger in America from lots of different sources, and that anger can be both real or it can be anger that is grown from perception. But rather, regardless of whether it's grounded in reality or perception, that anger still must be contended with. We can't ignore it, right? And even though that anger that isn't legitimate, we can't simply brush it off or roll our eyes at it or simply say, you haven't suffered like we've suffered. It doesn't work. And I want to share it in this way. I'll close with a story that was a long answer to a short question, but I think it's worth diving into, which is this. My father used to tell a story about a woman who thought something was wrong with her arm. And she went to the doctor to see what was wrong with her arm. And the doctor looked at her arm and he said nothing was wrong and sent her home. On the way home, she stopped at the butcher's. And the butcher asked her how she was doing. And she mentioned, that she thought something was wrong with her arm. And she went to the doctor and he asked her what the doctor said. And she said, the doctor said there was nothing wrong, right? 3 months later, she still thought something was wrong with her arm. So she went back to the doctor. And the doctor said, there is nothing wrong with your arm. I've looked, there's nothing wrong with your arm. And so she went away and she stopped at the butcher's again. And the butcher asked her how her arm was doing. And she said, I think something's wrong with it, but the doctor says there's nothing wrong. Well, 3 months after that, right? Now, 7 months later, she was convinced something was wrong with her arm. So she went back to the doctor. Doctor saw her, looked at her arm, and then said and admonished her, there's nothing wrong with your arm. Stop coming to me about your arm. There's nothing wrong with it. I don't want to see you here about your arm again. So she left and she went back and she stopped at the butcher's on the way home. And the butcher said, how's your arm doing? And she said, you know, I don't know. I think something's wrong with it, but the doctor says there's nothing wrong with it. He doesn't want to see me anymore. And so then the butcher said, well, you know, since you first told me, I've been studying surgeries. I've got some books from the library and I've been looking at them. Now, I'm not a surgeon, so, you know, but I'm willing to try. And here's the end of the story. So what does this woman do? Does she keep going back to the doctor who won't listen to her, the doctor who won't spend the time looking at her arm? Or does she go with the butcher who's at least willing to try? That's what I mean about understanding anger in this moment. When we try to just lessen the anger, if we tell folks we can't hear you when you're angry at us, if we tell folks that their anger isn't legitimate, we leave them with few choices. Again, it doesn't matter whether it's legitimate anger, such as the anger coming from the Black community today around police violence, or the perception of many within the Trump coalition, right, that they're losing status or they're losing privileges in this society. We have to approach that anger, right, with compassion, with sincerity, with discipline, and understanding that the role and task is on us to provide an alternative, a way to orient that anger that builds our community and doesn't separate us.
Thank you.
And Eric, I have another question for you, but before I ask, I just wanted to remind all of our participants that they can, if they have questions coming up while you're speaking, they can enter them into the chat and we will ask you toward the end of the program. So people, wonderful. There's the chat and we'd love to see your questions.
I love questions.
Good.
I apologize for interrupting. It's not the chat, it's the QA button at the bottom of your screen.
Thank you. The Q&A.
The question and answer, the Q&A.
Yes, got it. Hopefully everybody heard that. Today's the second anniversary of the tragic deaths at the Tree of Life Synagogue in Pittsburgh by a white supremacist. And Nikita Malik, director of the Center on Radicalization and Terrorism at the Henry Jackson Society, said, health misinformation, anti-Muslim sentiment, and anti-Semitism have all been on the rise this year as we spend more and more time indoors and in front of screens. And an alarming theme has emerged across the extremist spectrum, she said. It doesn't matter if you're far right or far left. The one thing they have in common is extreme anti-Semitism. And I know that you have written about this and thought about it and talked about it. So we'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah. So it's interesting when we talk about anti-Semitism, and I want to be clear, anti-Jewish bigotry, right? The hatred of Jews is the oldest form of bigotry, except, right, misogyny, the hatred of women, right? Anti-Semitism has been around for anti-Jewish hatred has been around for a very long time. Now, anti-Semitism is a specific form of anti-Jewish bigotry. So I'm going to say that again, because there's a lot of jumbling of words. Anti-Semitism is a specific form of anti-Jewish bigotry that is rooted in the mid to late 1800s. And what's unique about it, right, is that it was the racialization of Jews. Anti-Semitism signifies the moment where Jews being seen as another race and being on the receiving end of racial bigotry becomes the dominant form of anti-Jewish hatred in the world. And it's a European, largely it's a European construction. So to be clear, I'm not saying anti-Jewish, and I'm gonna hang on for a second here. I'm gonna go to Spurs for a second. Marcia, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So what's important here is that preceding that, most, not all, but most anti-Jewish hatred was grounded in a religious form of bigotry or cultural forms of bigotry, right, around peoplehood. This racialization, this thing called anti-Semitism, is significant. And it gets its fuel when the Russian Tsar and Tsarist, who are concerned about the rise of democracy in Europe, particularly in France, decide to fake a document. Secret police hire a writer and forger to plagiarize from different things and form a story. And the story becomes known as the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion, and it makes an appearance in the early 1900s. The Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion purports to tell a story of Jewish elders gathering together at midnight in a cemetery to plot the takeover of European Christendom. And this fake story goes on to purport that they attempt to do this through the taking over of the media, culture, right, by expanding democracy. And this is shared and intentionally distributed by Russian secret police. It's kind of interesting to parallel right now because the purpose was to undercut democracy. Eventually, that comes to the United States. And Henry Ford, who is a wealthy industrialist who invents the mass production of the automobile, comes across the Protocols of the Learned Elders of Zion. It resonates with him. He believes it, and he republishes it as a series of essays known as the International Jew. And he publishes it in his newspaper, which is sold through Ford dealerships across the country, exposing hundreds of thousands of Americans to this powerful but fake narrative. It was the equivalent of QAnon of its day.
Mr. Ward, I apologize, but we seem to have lost your camera.
We have lost the camera. Let me try.
There we go. It's back. Thank you.
Is it back? Okay.
Yes, thank you. I apologize for.
No problem. Thank you for letting me know. So this becomes the key narrative of anti-Jewish bigotry in our time. What happens in the United States is that anti-Semitism evolves once more. Jews are not merely another race in American anti-Semitism. They are seen as something wholly other. It's often why you see anti-Semitic characters of Jews that paint them as lizards, right, or otherworldly entities. Anti-Semitism has been part and parcel of the United States since the 1800s in that racialized form, and it has driven much the narrative of the white nationalist movement today. Anti-Semitism isn't just a component of white nationalism, right? It is the component of anti-Semitism and white nationalism in America. The hatred of anti-Semitism as a form of hatred is used to justify and explain, right, how the civil rights movement was successful to white nationalists. Remember, white nationalists do not see African Americans, right, as fully actualized human beings. They see us as inferior. So there was no way that they could accept, right, that we beat them politically during the civil rights movement. That's impossible in their mindset. So they had to find another answer, and that bonded them to anti-Semitism. By adopting anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews, it provided a new worldview that allowed them to continue
to dehumanize Black folks, right? It was not the fault of Blacks that they lost this country and they lost white supremacy. It was the fault of Jews in their minds. It allowed them to continue to deny agency from Black people, and to deny the legitimate grievances that Black people and others have in this society, whether it's Muslims, immigrants, women, workers. All of it becomes merely puppets on the strings of what they call the Jewish puppet masters. And that is the narrative of anti-Semitism. And without addressing that anti-Semitism, it's impossible to hold the white nationalist movement accountable. It is why we were late in responding to the QAnon conspiracy. It is why this administration has not been held accountable for all of its anti-Semitism over the last 5 years, including before it was in office. We don't understand anti-Semitism in the ways we think we do. We make a lot of assumptions about our knowledge of anti-Semitism, and left unlearned, anti-Semitism continues to weave its power across America, not only in the killings of Jews, such as the Tree of Life, which occurred 2 years ago today, but also the mass murders of Latinos in El Paso at the Walmart, or African Americans worshiping in a church, right, in Charlottesville, South Carolina, or Sikhs worshiping in Madison, Wisconsin. While indeed racism and xenophobia and Islamophobia played a role, the driving engine was anti-Semitism. And it's why I say, Marcia, at the end of the day, anti-Semitism may prove to be more dangerous to non-Jews than the Jewish community itself. But we can't address it unless we acknowledge it exists. And too many of us in the anti-racist, in the human rights and civil rights movement are too flat-footed on anti-Semitism. We have made lots of gains over the last 3 years, particularly through the leadership and efforts of Jews of color and amazing Jewish communal organizations. But we on the left, we who are progressives, who are non-Jews, have a long way to go in catching up to the real threat that anti-Semitism is in America. It doesn't function like anti-Black racism. It doesn't function like anti-immigrant or anti-Muslim bias in our society. It is its own form of bigotry. And waiting for it to look like anti-Black racism is dangerous, because by the time anti-Semitism resembles anti-Black racism in this country, we are way too far out of the gate to be able to save democracy.
Thank you.
Thank you, Eric, for that great clarity on anti-Semitism, and another look at how we should be viewing that. So the next question is, reported by CNN in February, white supremacists are officially more of a threat to New Jersey than both ISIS and Al-Qaeda. According to state security officials, in New Jersey's annual terrorism threat assessment report, the state raised the threat level for white supremacist extremists to high, the topmost category of threat level for any extremist group. How do we respond if we find white supremacists are organizing in our communities? And how do we protect our young people from efforts to recruit them?
These are really important questions. And, I think it is one of the reasons I feel commonality with New Jersey. Even though New Jersey has much more of a urban centers to it, there is a lot of similarities between Oregon and New Jersey in terms of hate groups. And I think one of the reasons has to do with systemic segregation in society. Systemic segregation gives rise to racial extremism on the right. And we should understand in the long term, right? The reason that happens is because segregation breaks down community intimacy. You cannot be intimate right, with your neighbors. You can't build that demographic intimacy when segregation is in place in housing, transportation, employment, education, right, and other sectors. White nationalists understand this, and it becomes ripe ground for recruitment. So it doesn't surprise me, and it has never surprised me, that New Jersey has such a large segment of white nationalist and organizations and hate groups there, similar to Oregon. Also, we're similar in terms of hate crimes, right? I recently read that New Jersey has the highest reported hate crimes in something like 20 to 25 years, right? That it is significant. And the largest, the single largest victims of hate violence are Black folks, right? And the next largest grouping are Jews, right? And that tells us something about the nature of hate in our two states. I would say to folks that there are a couple of ways. There's the short-term rapid response, and then I want to come back to that long-term shift that needs to happen. The short-term, I think, Reverend, is this. When you notice something that might be white supremacist, like tagging, or someone who's flying a swastika outside their home or on their car, etc., try to document it, right? Try to document it, but only do so if it is safe. It's important to begin documentation. Documentation will help your community understand how broad the problem is, right? And what is the best course of response. The second is, like every community organization, every entity, right? Whether it's a church or a business or a government agency or a social service, right? Or a quilting club, right? Should arrange a bystander intervention training, right? It is important that we begin to understand how we can intervene to de-escalate situations that occur in our community. And we only do that through practice, right? And trainings give us a chance to practice, because if we don't practice, what will happen in those moments is that we will just freeze, right? We will not make a decision. Even our decision not to intervene won't be a conscious decision. That's what happens under stress. And that's why practice and rehearsal are so critically important. So monitoring, bystander training. And the third is this. In every community, there should be a Soma action, right? That networks civil society together, so that civil society can come together in these moments where acts of hate are so visible that they demand an effective response and large-scale response. It is a way, by coming together, of holding elected and public officials accountable, right? Of holding law enforcement agencies responsible, that I think are critically important. So those are three things that I would give to folks that anyone can do right off the bat. There are bystander intervention trainings that are available online, on YouTube, right? There are probably trainers in your community. And that should happen for every entity. And you should try to arrange it at least twice a year, right? And to open it up. I want to talk quickly about the long-term piece. We have to tackle segregation, right? And I'm going to relate it to a story. I tell this story a lot because I think it's an important story. Now, I think it was probably 3.5 years ago, maybe it was a little over 3. There was a huge alt-right demonstration here in Portland, in downtown Portland. And to reinforce the idea that these are organizers as well, right? They planned it outside of a blues festival because they knew there would be lots of people coming in and out. They also knew it was a blues festival, so it was likely to draw Portland's small, right, but energized community of color to it. And they planned it right around the time that they knew the news would air in the evening, so that people watching in the surrounding suburbs or at home would catch, right, what they hoped would be their theater of violence, right? The spectacle that media has come to love. And I was monitoring and kind of watching this event, and I noticed something that I watched, which was there was a person who had a camera who was like had cornered this young white nationalist or alt-right activist who was just sitting somewhere, probably catching his breath, or he was just sitting. And the guy was like haranguing him, like, why are you here? No one wants you here, right? The mayor doesn't want you here. Protesters don't want you here, right? Why are you here in our community? And this young alt-right activist responded and said, yeah, I heard, you all don't want us here. But the truth of the matter is Portland is a city with a shrinking Black population by both percentage and whole number, right? Which is true. And then he looked this camera guy in the eye and he said, so you can say you don't want us here, but the fact of the matter is you are doing something we could never get away with. You are actually disappearing the Black community of Portland. That was his response, right? And he's right. And we have to acknowledge that he was right. And he was telling us something. He was calling us hypocrites, right? The truth is, if we want to know why the white nationalist movement has been so successful, we have to start by looking in the mirror, right? And when we look in that mirror, what you will see is that what we are offering for the future does not compete, right? Not in clarity, not in joy, not in comfort. It does not vision an America, right, that is joyful, energized, and full of opportunity and hope. At a time when people feel so unanchored, they will attach themselves to the known, to the tangible, even if they know, right, it's unhealthy, then the unknown thing that seems frightening. So if we really want to compete against the white nationalist movement, and we can, we do not have to be a defensive movement. We should recognize the white nationalist movement exists in America today because of what our ancestors did in the mid-1960s, right? That started in the 1940s. They laid down their lives, they took beatings, they were shunned, they lost their jobs for us to be in the moment we find ourselves in right now. We are not witnessing a white nationalist revolution. We are witnessing a white nationalist backlash in America, a backlash against the gains of the 1965 civil rights movement. So we can be cynical. We can be these Eeyores and say nothing has changed, nothing has improved. I will not do that to my ancestors. I will not do that to people who struggle to bring us here. I'm not that cynical. What I understand is now this is our time to move forward, to carry the arc forward so that the next generation can sing their own song. And we do that by tackling segregation. Segregation is what prevents us from beating, right, and managing this white nationalist movement. Segregation in housing, segregation in transportation, segregation in education, segregation in employment. It has to crumble. And if we do not dismantle this, I guarantee you that we will continue to struggle with this white nationalist movement. And it will zap all of our energies, right? It will prevent us from tackling COVID-19. It will prevent us from tackling rapid unemployment in this country. That's why we need to take on segregation. Citigroup, right? Not the Progressive Western State Center. Citigroup just released a study on racial inequality and the economy. And it states in its own report that if we removed racial inequality in our economy, that in 5 years, we would add an additional $5 trillion to the US economy. an additional $5 trillion, right? We have to understand at the end of the day, while Black people are on the receiving end and other people of color, including indigenous communities, are on this receiving end of racism, all of us are losing. And we are losing much more than we think. So yes, we should monitor the white nationalist movement. We should make sure our institutions hold them accountable. We should make sure that we protect and defend the opportunities of our neighbors. But we have our own work to do still. And our work is making real, right, the 1965 civil rights movement. As John Lewis said, the 1965 civil rights movement took the idea, the American idea of democracy, right, and that was merely an aspiration, and turned it into a reality. Now, our work is to prove that we can manage it, right? If there is democracy in America, it is largely because Black people have brought that democracy to America. We should not be so quick to dismiss it. We should not be so quick to throw it away. But we all have real work to do. And that work isn't burdensome work. That work is about getting to know our neighbors, making sure we have intimacy. Intimacy is what brings health. Intimacy is what brings prosperity. And intimacy is what brings the possibilities of joy in this moment.
Thank you. I'm not sure if it's quite of a follow-up, but the next question is going back to your 21 things, your point 2 of your 21 things, you state, honor the grief and anger that the public is feeling over the recent lynchings of Black Americans, many at the hands of law enforcement. Who, why, and how, if anyone in particular, are you talking to, as many Black Americans are experiencing that grief and anger that you speak of?
Yeah. So I'm talking to everyone who is not Black, Indigenous, or Latino in America, right? In particular, I'm talking to folks who live in comfort, right? I say this as I'm a person who understands that anger. I feel that anger each and every day. And I've experienced that police brutality, not once in my life, but several times, right? As a child, right? As a young adult, right? Mm-hmm. And even several years ago, on my way to work in my suit from Grand Central Station to the Ford Foundation as the program officer of civil rights, mm-hmm. right? I understand the anger, and I feel that anger. The problem is too many in America refuse to accept the anger, right? And so here's how I like to explain it. George Floyd was killed by police. And again, as you all know, I don't use the word murder because his killing is the law of the land, right? It is protected by the law.
Right.
George Floyd had a police officer who kneeled on his neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And I want folks to think about that. 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Think about something you have done. Try meditating, right? Hope when everyone gets off this call that they set their alarm for 8 minutes and 46 seconds and try to sit perfectly still. Try not to hold a thought. Look at how much concentration it takes, right, to sit still for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Now imagine that energy that must have gone into leaning on someone's neck for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he is telling you that you are killing him, right? Imagine the people who stood around, the other police officers standing around for 8 minutes and 46 seconds. Think about the energy that it took for them not to intervene or say something or put their hands on the back of that police officer and tell him enough. Think about all the people watching for 8 minutes and 46 seconds who chose not to intervene, right? And then think, how can you ask Black people not to be angry when all of our stories, as Agent Marie Brown tells us, are nothing but horror stories, right? That is real anger. And that's not to make people feel afraid. And it's not to make people feel guilty. Look, none of us were around 500 years ago when white supremacy was established as a system. None of us are responsible for the creation of that system. We are merely responsible for what happens around us now. And being responsible means being vulnerable enough to accept the deep injustice that Black people experience, Indigenous people and Latinos experience in America. And it means being vulnerable enough to accept that you will never quite understand what that looks like, right? I think of the book, the old book from the 1950s, I think it is, Black Like Me, which is a white journalist. Folks have never read that book. You should read the book. Don't watch the movie. Read the book. At the end of the book, this white journalist who did things to be able to pass as Black writes something at the very end that I think everyone should write. This was not some rabid liberal or progressive like me. He was just a journalist. And what he wrote was, he was so angry after merely 1 year, right, that he found himself on the edge of violence each and every day. And what he says after that is much more of a shocker, which is he didn't even understand how Black people could stand not to be violent for 1 day, let alone generations, right? That is the level of anger that resides in the Black community, right? That's also how much discipline resides in the Black community. Because the Black community isn't looking for revenge, right? The Black community is not looking to burn down the democracy that it actually helped build, right? The Black community is simply looking for peace and equity in society. That's what Black Lives Matters means. Black Lives Matters isn't a controversial thing to say. In fact, Black Lives Matters is probably the least controversial thing that one can say. And so we have to acknowledge that anger. We're not going to ever understand it. If you're not Black, you will not understand it, right? Except if maybe you're Indigenous or Latino. But just because you can't understand it doesn't mean that you can't validate it. And just because you can't understand it doesn't mean that you have to try to rationalize what is happening to Black folks each and every day in America, right? And so what I meant by anger, just as I'm saying about white folks who are angry, right, is that we have to be willing to hold that anger with compassion. We have to be willing to hold that anger, understanding that it is historic and generational. And we have to trust that Black people who have actually built this democracy, right, want to continue to build this democracy. Right. We are trying to get folks, right? We're not climbing the mountain anymore, right? This is one of the things I wrote in A Message to the Mountain, reflecting on Martin Luther King's speech, right? We're not climbing the mountain to the promised land anymore, folks, right? I'm here to tell you something. We're actually standing on the mountaintop, right? We're actually looking over the promised land, right? Into the promised land. But we can't get there unless all of us go together, right? And I want to go there. Black folks want to go there. We do not want to stay where we are right now, right? Folks didn't sacrifice so much over generations to get us to the mountaintop to stand around. So it's time to get moving. And how we get moving is we trust Black leadership, right? Doesn't mean that we're not going to fight, but we understand that Black folks have set a historical track record for strengthening democracy in this country. And we're at a time where democracy needs strengthening in our society.
Mhm.
We have to trust Black folks to do that.
Mhm. Thank you.
Eric, thank you so much for responding to our questions with such passion and wisdom.
Thank you.
There are some questions from our attendees. I don't think that we'll get to all of them, but there's one that I'd like to share from Reverend Gladys Moore. And she says there was an article yesterday in the Washington Post about the growing number of patriot churches that have sprung up in support of the Trump administration. This is so-called Christian nationalism, and it sounds like what you were describing about Portland 30 years ago. In what ways would you respond to these kinds of churches and their mission to, quote unquote, re-Christianize the USA?
Yeah. So there is a movement, I'll throw out a couple of terms really quickly that folks can Google for more background, but for more than 40 years, right? Social movements never just appear on the scene, just like fashions, right? They start coming down the runway, and then in 5 years, they have some influence on what's being sold, right, on clothing racks around the country. So too is it with social movements. And what's known as Christian nationalism, which I actually just call, it's really Christian as synonymous with white, but I'll get to that in a second. Christian nationalism has its roots in Reconstructionism, right, and Dominion theology. And it's an idea that Christians have the right to rule this society, right, as Christians, that this is a Christian nation, despite what the founding fathers and right hundreds of years of legal precedents set. And they seek to establish their dominion over the United States so that it can be run through biblical law. It is not a democracy that folks are working for, but a theocracy. Right? And that system has been, those groups have been quite active. You can find the roots as far back as the Christian Coalition in the 70s and 80s, a coalition on revival. It is dangerous, but I want to be clear about this Christian nationalism. Christian, right? The term Christian, as it is used by these groupings, is a nice way of saying white. Now, it's not a racial definition of whiteness. It's a cultural definition of whiteness. But what they mean is that you are Christian to the extent that you resemble that culture of whiteness that they have established. And the further you are outside that culture of whiteness, the less Christian you are. That movement has been quite active around the Trump administration. It has been active in Oregon, right? There were fights with the Oregon Citizens Alliance in the 1990s, right, as it attacked the LGBTQ community in this country. Before that, right, they fought divestment from South Africa, right, around apartheid. So they've been around us for a long time. What it calls for is a theological response, right, that is grounded in scripture and eschatology. What we aren't seeing, right, are faith leaders responding to these false biblical arguments being laid out. What we aren't seeing are denominations, right, and churches releasing, right, statements grounded in biblical interpretation that reject white nationalism, that reject this overt racism, that reject, right, this culture of whiteness that denies, right, the humanity of others. So it's uncontested terrain, and in uncontested terrain, we can't be surprised, right, that this social movement continues to expand, grow, and build new tools.
Why do you think it goes uncontested?
I think we're afraid in some ways. we're afraid by the energy, right, that we experience. Two, we have taught ourselves to be hesitant in terms of our values. We become less dependent on our values and more dependent on ideologies, which, you know, ideologies are flawed by their very nature. Values, right, can be wrestled with. And so we lean too much into left, right, conservative, liberal, Democrat, Republican, versus values of inclusion versus values of exclusion. And I think when we do lean into our values, right, we're actually quite strong. We're quite prophetic in our voices. I think we worry. We worry that we will turn folks away. I am, you know, I will say as someone who comes out of the Baptist tradition, right? So I'll think of like Christian scripture. Yes. Right. And I think of the quote, right? Neither hot nor cold. Yes. Right. And not hot, you know, neither hot nor cold, right, means we then are vomited out. Right. Our values are lukewarm right now because we're not stirring them up. We're not fighting for them. We're not expressing them with the prophetic voices that we know reside inside of us.
Okay, thank you. The next question comes from Ina Weitzman and asks, can you speak to anti-Semitism within Black Lives Matter?
Yeah, this question comes up a lot. And I think it's a good question. It's an important question. So one of the things I wanted to say earlier is you know, I talked a lot about the white nationalist movement and how anti-Semitism is the core, right? It's not so again, my response to this question isn't going to make sense unless you accept for a second that I am arguing anti-Semitism within the white nationalist movement isn't a byproduct, right? It's not something that just happens happenstance. It's not just one of the things, right, that mobilizes it. It is the thing that mobilizes it, right, within the white nationalist movement. But we also have to realize that white nationalists don't bring anti-Semitism to our communities. They simply organize the anti-Semitism that already exists. Like racism, like homophobia, right, like Islamophobia, right? These forms of bigotry, anti-Semitism isn't just a set of behaviors, right? It's not just a set of slurs. It's a system. It's an ideology, right? It's a way of seeing the world, and it serves a purpose, right, in our world. What is the purpose of anti-Semitism in modern day America? No one ever asked that question, but I'm going to offer an answer. One of the roles of anti-Semitism in present day America is to be able to attack democratic practice, right? By saying democratic practice isn't really democratic, right? It's controlled by a secret cabal. But the other purpose of anti-Semitism in modern day America is to place Jews as a buffer, right, between the haves and the have-nots. That's not unique, right? That's not news to probably Jews who are listening right now. They'll say, yeah, we learned that in Europe and over thousands of other years. But that is the role that it serves. So if anti-Semitism is supposed to be a buffer between the haves and the have-nots, it is quite rational to accept that when anti-Semitism expresses itself, it is largely going to express itself with the have-nots in our society, because that's what it's set up and designed to do, right? To give the have-nots in a society a scapegoat in which to express their anger on. Now, we can get mad at the have-nots for that. We can say, how dare you do exactly what anti-Semitism was designed to do, right? But if we do that, we're a little bit hypocritical here, because it's not like we have spent decades, right, working in communities of color to educate them on anti-Semitism. It's not like, right, Jewish communal organizations, right? And I'm going to come to the civil rights piece because that's typically the next question, right? The 1960s. What about the 1960s? But, right, it's not as if the Jewish community has been in a deep discussion in America about anti-Semitism, right? I authored Skin in the Game, right? About 4 months before Charlottesville, before the Unite the Right rally, right? It's hard to imagine 3 years ago, but let's do it for a second. 3 years ago, before Charlottesville, I guarantee you, most of the folks on this call were not talking about anti-Semitism. And if you were talking about anti-Semitism, you were primarily talking about it in relationship to Palestine and Israel, or you were talking about it in France or the UK, right? Or in places in Europe. Most communal organizations that I spoke to previous to authoring my article said to me that anti-Semitism was not a big deal any longer in America. That was the conventional wisdom. So we can't be ahistoric right now. We have to accept that we have only really been talking, and I say this as a non-Jew, right, who has been doing work around anti-Semitism for decades. We have only been addressing anti-Semitism in a serious, deep way over the last 3 years. And a lot of gains have been made by a lot of Jewish communal organizations, Jews of color, right, and other leaders in the Jewish community. But there's still a long way to go. So now I want to come to Black Lives Matters. So what about anti-Semitism in Black Lives Matters? Well, the way that it usually gets expressed to me is as a form of defense. And so I want to address that first. Usually when folks ask me, well, what about anti-Semitism in Black Lives Matters? It's usually said to me it's meant to say a few things. The first is that it's just as bad as the white nationalists. So why should we be focused on white nationalism? That's one way that it gets said. The other way it usually gets offered on to me is Black Lives Matters is anti-Semitic. So I'm not going to do anything around countering policing, right? Or addressing racial justice. That's the second way it gets offered. And then the third way is with real deep actual commitment, right? Like, how do we address anti-Semitism within Black Lives Matters so that we have a stronger, more effective movement, right? It's that third way that I think is so critical. So here's my answer. Does anti-Semitism exist within Black Lives Matters? And when I'm talking about Black Lives Matters, not talking about the organization Black Lives Matters that was started by 3 Black women, one who is both Black and Jewish, right? What I'm talking about is Black Lives Matters, which means I'm a member of Black Lives Matters in that theory, right? My organization is in support of Black Lives Matters under that. When we say Black Lives Matters, it is a large envelope, right? It means, right? It means tons of things. 2 people in Nebraska, right? And their Twitter feed, or an organization of 500 people based out of Atlanta and everything in between. There is no head to that Black Lives Matters. There is no single leadership to that Black Lives Matters. And that Black Lives Matters contains all of the diversity of Black America and all the diversity of America. So if there is anti-Semitism in America, if we accept that, we also have to accept that there is unaddressed anti-Semitism within that large Black Lives Matters movement. And just how anti-Semitism in America today, right, doesn't make America a bad place. It makes America a struggling place. Finding anti-Semitism within that larger Black Lives Matters doesn't make it a bad thing. It makes it a struggle, right? But I want to be clear about some other points here. And I'm just going to go on a little bit more because I think this is I love this question. The first is we should reflect that Black Lives Matters, neither the organization or the large umbrella, right, has ever released a document, right, or on promoting anti-Semitism, right? What most folks are thinking about is a discussion paper that was released part of the movement for Black Lives, right? Which is a whole nother entity, right? And that discussion paper has long been removed. There have been lots of conversations, right, around that. There have been deep conversations in the Black community on anti-Semitism. Do we see anti-Semitism in the Black community? Is the Black community more prone to anti-Semitism? Yes, not because folks are Black, but that's because what anti-Semitism was designed to do, right? It was designed to prey on the most powerless in our society, to protect the most powerful, and to make Jews the sacrificial lambs, right, of that buffer. Do we have work to do around anti-Semitism in the Black community? Absolutely. But I reject this idea of Black anti-Semitism, right? And I reject it because you never hear folks talk about white anti-Semitism, right? You just hear folks talk about anti-Semitism. And that's because there is no Black or white anti-Semitism. There is no left or right anti-Semitism. There is merely anti-Semitism in America and how social movements seek to tap into it. But there is also the question of power in society. If you were telling me, right, if you were telling me that you are concerned about the anti-Semitism emanating from Black Lives Matter, and that it equals the anti-Semitism coming out of the Trump administration, you are not reading power in this society, and you are not reading influence in this society. And I see it over and over, right? Deshaun Jackson, right, who made this vile anti-Semitic rhetoric that was clearly grounded. It wasn't just a mishap. It was grounded in an ideology, right, that no one ever had the chance to intervene with him on. And so he said something very vile. I watched Deshaun Jackson get beaten up across social media. Deshaun Jackson, right, and his loss of status. That same week, Madonna, right, said something equally anti-Semitic, right? Nothing happened to Madonna, right? And I can tell you more people listen to Madonna even now, right, than Deshaun Jackson. So I'm not telling folks don't hold Deshaun Jackson accountable. What I'm saying is when you hold Black people to a different set of standard than others who dabble in anti-Semitism, it looks like racism, right? And that's because multiple oppressions can function at the same time. Just because we are the victims of one form of oppression doesn't mean that we can't be the perpetrators of others. And when we don't recognize the racial dynamics in how we respond to incidences of anti-Semitism, it weakens us all. It looks like we are waging partisan attacks rather than a disciplined confrontation, right, of anti-Semitism in America. So all of us have to do better. And I include myself in that, right? Yes, there is nothing wrong with holding people accountable for dabbling in anti-Semitism. But let's be clear, there is a difference between Deshaun Jackson, right, and a Louis Farrakhan or a David Duke, right, in the ways that they choose to dabble into anti-Semitism. There is a huge difference, right, between the white nationalist movement and those individuals who dabble in anti-Semitism within the Black Lives Matters movement every once in a while, who then get called on it. We should not be drawing equivalencies there. That does not prevent us from saying that we oppose all anti-Semitism and we will speak to all anti-Semitism. What we won't do is engage in the inequalities that this society has structured.
Great, thank you.
Thank you. I just wanted to apologize to everybody who has put a question in the Q&A because we don't have time to address all the questions, but there is one I think that will leave us on an up note.
Right.
It's a question that asks, who and what gives you hope on the landscape? Who's promoting values of unity and acceptance?
Yeah, I mean, we are lucky to live in a time, we live in a time of great women right now. And you know, if 2020 has given us nothing else, it has given us an amazing number of strong women voices. And that has really kept me up, right? It has boosted me. And I think about that. I think about Black women. I think about women of color, right? I think of white women who, you know, get a lot of heat these days after the election results of last time. I see all these women working so tirelessly and getting so much done, like inching us all forward with kind of just a steadiness that is just builds courage. So it brings me a lot of hope. I'm going to talk about one woman because I know if we've all figured out, I really did grow up Baptist. You can tell by my long answers, right?
Couldn't tell.
But I will share one woman who super inspires me each and every day. And I have to say, besides my partner of 15 years, right? And this woman is the young daughter of George Floyd, who was killed by police in Minneapolis. I saw a video 3 or 4 months ago of George Floyd's daughter in the midst of a huge demonstration in the streets of Minneapolis. And she was on the shoulders, I don't know, a family friend or relative. She was just on the shoulders. And I mean, there were tens of thousands of people around with Black Lives Matter signs and chanting. And there was, you know, I mean, it was just a beautiful demonstration. You could just see her just looking around. And I heard her say something on the video. It's on YouTube. You all can probably find it. She says something suddenly. She says, my daddy changed the world. And I think about that every day. I think about this young girl, right, whose father never gets to see her off to the prom, who never gets to see her, you know, never gets to hand her off to her partner, right, who never gets to teach her how to drive or to play sports. And she never gets her father back. But I thought, she's right. Her father did change the world, right? And I think about her because I think about her and her voice because I just think, you know what? This young woman is deserving of that changed world. And we owe her that world. And that is not an ugly, nightmarish world. It is a world of hope. It is a world of wonder, right? Where she gets to celebrate what her dad has done. And I have seen folks each and every day moving that work forward for her and other children just like her. And she brings me hope. She's my hero right now, right? She's a bigger hero than anyone on Marvel right now. And she's my hero because she hasn't forgotten wonder, curiosity, possibility, and joy. She is the opposite of despair. And that's why she brings me hope. And I hope she brings you all hope too.
Thank you, Eric. This has been an excellent hour and a half. It's amazing. It has been an hour and a half, but we are grateful that you have, we were able to get you to be part of this event on tonight and engage us in thought. You've challenged us. You've given us some ideas and some strategies that we can contemplate and in which we can seek to implement. So we are grateful to you for this time and conversation that we have entered into. Thank you again. Or can you tell folks that if they want to hear more of what you are saying and what you are doing, can you give us your website and your Twitter handle?
Yes, so you can follow me at my 7-year-old wrestling Twitter handle. I wanted to be a pro wrestler when I was 7. It's at Bulldog Shadow. Please follow me so I have some company over there and say hi. You can visit us at westernstatecenter.org, westernstatescenter.org, or find us Western State Center on Medium, and you will see a series of essays that I've written over the year that speak to this moment and I think speak to hope.
Thank you. Thank you. Marsha, any last words?
Yes, thank you so much.
Wow.
This is just so moving, so important, gives us so much to think about and a lot to do. And I want to thank all of the sponsors and the committee that organized this. It couldn't have been more important at this time. So thank you all.
Thank you, Summit Orange. Go change the world.
Thank you, Eric.
We're working
Thank
on
you to everyone. Have a good night.
Good night.
Are we going to stop recording?